That night, the wind was sharp as teeth, cold, cutting through pine trees and porch boards, howling like old ghosts through the wooden beams of the half-repaired log cabin. Snow fell thick, slanting, heavy as wool, blanketing the world in silence and sorrow. It was the kind of night plainsfolk feared most, not for wolves or raiders, but for the stillness it brought. And what memories might flood back in that stillness? Ellen Dean swung her axe in rhythm, her breath puffing out like a specter before her. Her skirt was hiked up and pinned, her boots white to the ankles. Each crack of the axe echoed into the wood. Each split of frozen timber was an answer to the ache in her shoulders. She didn't glance back at the cabin, though she knew her children watched from the frosted window, their small faces round and pressed to the glass like pale moons. Inside, warmth flickered. A fire, carefully built from logs and kindling, tried its best to hold back the winter seeping through every crack. Beside it were her son and daughter, twin souls born in a summer storm 8 years ago. Their names were Ruth and Josiah, but she rarely called them aloud. Names were like promises, and Ellen had learned to keep promises quietly. "Mama looks cold," Josiah whispered, his voice breaking a day of silence. He didn't often speak first. Ruth reached for his hand and said nothing. They waited, watching their mother work in the blizzard. When she finally came inside, the storm followed her, white and fierce on her shoulders, her eyelashes iced, her shawl stiff with frost. She shut the door with her hip, dropped the firewood with a sigh, and turned to the fire. She nodded at the children. No words, just a nod. She wasn't cruel, but kindness had become something she carried in quiet gestures. A hand on a head, a blanket tucked tight. Her voice was low and hoarse, like a riverbed smoothed by time and flood. They ate in silence, save for the pop of pine logs, cornbread and boiled turnips in brine. Nothing more. Josiah tried not to wince. Ruth chewed carefully, as if gratitude could soften the blandness. Ellen watched them eat, knees tucked under her wool skirt, and her gaze softened. If only a little. She'd once imagined this moment firelight on their cheeks, the cabin full of warmth and stories. But the man she'd built that dream with had never been one to make stories real. He died last spring in a failed trade, 15 miles east near Copper Ridge. They said he'd done it to himself. Drunk. She took the news with dry eyes and an odd calm, as if part of her knew he'd leave without a proper goodbye. He'd left her in other ways before. After supper, Ellen tucked the children into the shared bed, piling thick blankets over their small bodies and kissing Ruth's forehead. She paused by Josiah, her hand smoothing his curly hair, so like his father's, only softer. He looked up at her and blinked slowly. "Are we okay if the snow doesn't stop?" She studied him, a boy pretending not to be afraid. "Snow always stops," she said. Then a sound came, faint, distant, something between a moan and a cry. The wind wailed, but this wasn't wind. Ellen went still. Years alone in the wild had taught her the language of storms, of creatures, of danger. This sound was human. "Stay here," she said, her hand already reaching for her shawl and the hunting knife on the shelf. Her hands were steady, her heart calmer than it should have been. She stepped into the night, snow blinding her, the lantern's light barely piercing the dark, a trembling yellow that made shadows crawl. She passed the horse barn, heading toward the cattle shed's edge, where the sound had come from. He was there, half buried in snow, like a scarecrow blown off its post. Blood stained the white around him, spreading slow like rust in water. His face tilted to one side, and in the flickering light, she saw bronze skin, high cheekbones, dark hair tangled and wild. Comanche. She caught her breath. Not from fear, not exactly. He didn't move. One arm was bent beneath him, the other stretched out as if he'd crawled the last few yards. His chest rose in shallow jerks. A raider, and she crouched beside him. Fingers on his neck, pulse faint. His skin burned despite the chill. A wound on one side, old, possibly infected, bruises along his ribs. She didn't know what story he carried, but it had ended here, in the snow at her feet. She should walk away. Let nature finish what violence had started. She owed nothing. Her husband's grave lay not 50 feet away. A cold, bitter reminder of how trust could harden a heart. He'd bled on her land, nearly died at her doorstep. She couldn't explain it, but she saw something in him not just broken, but enduring, like mountains after a fire. Ruth's voice carried on the wind. "Mama." Ellen glanced at the cabin. Her children waited. She sheathed the knife. "I'm not doing this for you," she whispered to the man in the snow. "I'm doing it for them." Dragging him was like hauling stone through the storm. She looped her arms under his, grunting with effort. Her boots slipped on ice. Each breath burned. Snow swallowed them as they moved. Two shadows stitched together by need and chance. Inside, warmth greeted them like an old friend, unsure if they should stay. The children gasped as she heaved the stranger onto the floor near the hearth. "Get me clean rags," she said. "And the whiskey." Ruth obeyed without question. Josiah stood back, eyes wide. "Is he bad?" he whispered. "He's hurt," she answered. "That's all we know for now." She cut away his crusted shirt, revealing skin scarred old and new. He was lean, hawk-like, nothing wasted, everything honed. She pressed a cloth to the torn flesh near his ribs. He flinched but didn't wake. The twins watched in silence. She cleaned the wound, poured whiskey into it. His breath hitched. One eye cracked open, amber light flashing sharp and dim with pain. He looked at her a moment, confusion spreading like smoke. Then he passed out again. Ellen sat back, wiping her hands on her skirt. The storm outside raged. The fire flared as snow melted on his skin. She looked at her children, at the man, at the frost on his lashes. This changed everything. But she didn't know why. Not yet, only that the wind no longer sounded so empty. By dawn, the storm had eased into silence. No more wind shrieking through shutters. No distant groans from the forest. Just snow. Thick, blinding, pristine, covering the earth like a shroud. The cabin sat half sunk in it, smoke from the chimney curling into a pale sky, a world drowned in white. Inside, the fire burned small and steady, like the house's pulse. Ellen sat beside it, sleeves rolled up, face drawn, hands stained with dried blood and the ache of decisions. The Comanche man lay on the floor where she'd left him, wrapped in blankets, forehead beaded with sweat. His wound had stopped bleeding, but the fever lingered. He muttered in a tongue she didn't know, restless, his body shifting as if fleeing something even in sleep. The children watched from their corner, bundled in blankets like nestlings. Josiah chewed the thread on his sleeve. Ruth stared at the man, her eyes steady, as if trying to decide who he was. He hadn't moved since midnight. His breathing had slowed some, less ragged. But Ellen knew infection was a shadow with many shapes. She'd seen men die days after wounds looked clean. She'd seen fever bend a body like fire bends paper. She rose slowly, knees stiff from hours on the floor, and dipped a rag in a basin. She pressed it gently to his forehead, his skin scorched under the cool cloth. But a shudder ran through his limbs as if he were made of snow. When he stirred, it wasn't from pain. It was thirst. His lips parted, cracked and dry. She reached for the tin cup by the hearth, held it to his mouth. He sipped without opening his eyes, swallowing hard. Then, barely a whisper, he said something. She didn't understand. His voice was hoarse. He opened one eye, just one, golden brown, glazed, still delirious with fever, but aware. He saw her, not just her shape or face, but her. She could tell. Something unspoken in the way he looked, unflinching, unwavering, as if he'd expected someone else and was surprised to be spared. She nodded once, as if to say, "All right, you're safe here." Though she said nothing, he closed his eye again. Sleep took him like a tide. She stepped outside to check the livestock. The barn held, snow piled high against the door, but the roof hadn't caved. The cow, Daisy, had bled once. The chickens clucked. Cold. Ellen cleared what she could, fed them with slow, practiced hands, then returned with an armful of firewood and shoulders dusted with frost. The stranger was awake when she returned. Not fully, but enough. He tried to sit up but couldn't, only groaned low and pained, falling back. Josiah flinched at the sound, then darted behind his sister. Ruth didn't move. Ellen crossed the room and knelt. "Don't," she said, voice soft but firm. "You'll tear it worse." His eyes found her again, clearer this time. He raised a hand slowly, pointed to himself, tapped his chest lightly, and said, "Tahu," or something like it. She hesitated, then repeated it slower. "Tahu." He blinked, almost nodded. He tried to speak again, but winced and fell silent. Ellen said nothing more. She didn't know his tongue, and he seemed to know little of hers. But a name was a start, and silence had its own language. The children stayed wary, especially Josiah. He stuck close to her, volunteering to chop wood just to be outside. Ellen let him, watching from the window, her heart twisting with old guilt white. He was too young for suspicion, but the world had forced it on him early. Losing a father, watching a mother carry everything, learning the language of hunger life like that sharpened a child's heart. That night, Ruth brought her small wooden rabbit to the man, placing it by his pallet without a word. He looked at it a long time, then nodded to her. When Ruth returned to her blanket, she said, "He's not bad." Ellen didn't answer. She didn't want to lie. Not to herself. Not to the children. She didn't know who he was. She only knew he hadn't raised a hand. He hadn't threatened. He'd bled quietly in her snow and accepted her care as if it surprised him. He lay by the fire for 4 days. The fever broke on the 3rd, sweat soaking the blankets, his breathing steady and calm. Ellen changed his bandages twice daily, cleaned the wound, fed him broth, and propped his head when he was strong enough to drink. He never asked why. He only watched, listened, and called her name one evening when the light was low. His voice was hoarse but careful. "Ellen." She looked up. The children were asleep. Snow whispered at the window. "That's right," she said. Then he looked away, as if the word itself had cost him something. His hands were calloused, scars along his arms shaped like a history carved in flesh. He'd seen war, maybe not all with guns. The next morning, he sat up on his own, trembling, slow but upright. Firelight cast gold across his face. His hair, now loose, dry, was tucked behind his ears. He looked younger than she'd first thought. Not young, but not old. Maybe 30. Maybe 30 lives lived. He gestured toward the door, signaled he'd go. She understood. She shook her head. "You need another day." He tilted his head, then nodded, accepted it. The strange thing was how easily he accepted her lead. Not from weakness, but as if he trusted her judgment over his own stubbornness. That afternoon, while Josiah napped, Ellen sat by the hearth, stitching a patch onto his coat. She glanced at the man's form, his chest rising slow, fingers twitching in sleep, and wondered what world he came from, what he'd seen, what had brought him this far north, to snow, to her life. Then she realized he hadn't once reached for a weapon, hadn't asked, hadn't glanced at her knife or the old rifle by the door. That silence had weight. A knock startled her. 3 hard raps at the door. She stood, heart pounding, and opened it just enough to see. It was Ellis, the neighbor down the trail, a widower, jaw square, always smelling of tobacco smoke. He had offered to marry her after her husband died, but she knew it was pity dressed as protection. "Storms finally passed," he said. "Thought I'd check. Heard the mail rider say someone saw tracks near your barn." She gripped the door. Could be wolves. Ellis squinted at her. "Someone's in there." She didn't flinch. "My brother's boy, passing through. Sick." He studied her. "You be careful. Ellen, Comanche raiders been sighted south of here. If you're hiding something..." "I'm not," she said, calm as a still pond. He looked at her like a man measuring a fence post before leaning on it, then nodded. "Crocodile tears?" "All right, let me know if you need help." She shut the door before he finished. The man by the fire, Tahu, hadn't stirred. Or maybe he had and pretended not to. Either way, she said nothing. That night, when the children slept, Tahu stood for the first time. She helped him to the chair by the fire. He nodded once in thanks. They sat like that a long time, 2 shadows held by the flickering flame, saying nothing. Just the wind rising again. Softer this time. Fewer teeth. Quieter. Finally, she asked, "Are there more coming?" He hesitated, then shook his head. Not a word. Heavy with everything he chose not to say. She watched snow melt on his boots. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the only ghost in the room. Maybe tomorrow she'd ask more. But tonight, the fire was enough. Snow turned to mud by the 2nd week of March, leaving the world wet and sodden. Icicles fell from the eaves, and the wind, once cruel and cutting, grew feeble, content to rattle shutters and sweep the plains. Spring wasn't here? Not yet. But its promise hung in the air like the scent of lilacs not yet bloomed. And in that thawing world, something else began to warm, the distance between the Comanche and the widow. Tahu no longer slept by the fire. He'd taken a small corner near the hearth, where he wove a sleeping mat from spare blankets and pine boughs he gathered in the woods. His movements were careful, gentle, deliberate. He didn't linger where he wasn't needed. And Ellen noticed he never turned his back to the children, or to her. He stayed open, visible, unthreatening, as if he knew every inch of silence mattered in building trust. He didn't speak much, though his words grew. He knew the twins' names, Ruth and Josiah, and said them with a softness that surprised her. When he said Ellen's name, it was slow, steady, as if it carried reverence. He said Ellen, the second syllable catching in his throat like an unfinished song. She didn't ask questions, not yet. Some truths came slow and painful, needing silence to unfold. The children thawed faster than she expected. Ruth started showing him her charcoal drawings on cloth scraps. She explained each one solemnly, and though he didn't always understand the words, he nodded like they mattered. Josiah stayed wary, but the edge softened. He stopped clinging to her skirts or avoiding the hearth when Tahu was near. Instead, one morning, Ellen woke to find Josiah sitting cross-legged on the floor, showing Tahu a pine whistle he'd carved. The boy didn't say much, just offered it with shy fingers. Tahu examined it, blew once, a high, sweet note, and smiled. A small, fleeting smile, but real. Josiah smiled back. That was the morning Ellen realized she was watching them and feeling something foreign. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even relief. It was the troubling warmth of hope. And she'd learned hope was dangerous when left to grow unguarded. That same day, she and Tahu fixed the chicken coop roof together. He climbed the ladder without asking. When she handed him nails, their hands brushed, and neither pulled away. She watched him work, the way his hands moved with reverence. He handled even splintered wood like it deserved a second chance. "You've done this before," she said, breaking their usual silence. He nodded once. "Built much for my people," he said, glancing at her, then back to the sky. "Sent wife long ago." The wind tugged her skirt. She said nothing after. She didn't ask more. But she remembered how his eyes changed, how they clouded briefly, like clouds crossing a rising sun. That night, he built the fire without being asked. She let him. They'd settled into a life not quite normal, but familiar. He fished at the creek, brought back trout cleaned, and quietly offered. She made soup. He split wood without prompting. She mended his shirt, stitch by stitch, while he sat by the window carving a wooden bird for Ruth. No grand gestures, just small, quiet offerings people make when they want to stay. In the stillness between dusk and sleep, she found herself at the window, staring at the field behind the house. The moon etched silver into the earth. She felt him approach before she heard him. "Why didn't you go?" she asked. After the fever broke, it was silent a long time. "Didn't want to leave the children," he said at last. She turned, surprised by the answer's simplicity. "You stayed for them." He met her eyes. "They gave me a name. Not Savage, not Ghost, just Tahu." She swallowed. The fire popped behind them. His face, lit in that light, was solemn but kind. "Where would you go?" she asked. "Nowhere," he said. And then, after a breath, "No one waiting." So she nodded and said no more. The days after grew deeper. not through confessions, but through gestures. He helped Josiah learn to tie fishing knots. He gave Ruth a simple bracelet woven from dried grass, which she wore proudly on her wrist. He carved another whistle and gave it to Ellen. She didn't know what to do with it. Not at first. She left it by the hearth. But sometimes, when the children slept, she brought it to her lips and blew the softest notes into the late night. He watched her when she didn't notice. She watched him when he talked to the children. They circled each other in growing warmth. Then Ellis came again. He arrived unannounced, riding straight to the porch like it was his own. Ellen opened the door before he could knock. "Evening," he said, peering past her into the cabin. "Thought I'd check again. Strange tracks near the riverbank. Been seeing smoke from your chimney all week." "We've been burning wood," she said flatly. "Cold lingers." His eyes slid past her shoulder again. "Your nephew's still here." She didn't blink. "He's helping with chores. Needed a place to heal. Most wouldn't do such charity. I'm not most." His face shifted, tightening around the mouth, as if deciding how far to push. "You sure you're safe here?" "Ellen, a man like that, he's not one of us." She stepped onto the porch, not loud, not reaching for the rifle she kept behind the door. "He's done more for my children than most men, including ones who claimed to love me." Ellis stiffened. "People talk. Let them. You're putting those kids in danger." She stepped closer. "You're not here to help me, Ellis. You're here because you can't stand a woman doing fine without your coddling." He opened his mouth, but she shut the door before he could answer. Inside, Tahu sat still, hadn't moved. He'd heard. He always heard. That night, he went to the barn and didn't return until after midnight. She found him sitting on a hay bale, sharpening a knife slowly, eyes distant. "You're not the danger here," she said softly. He didn't look at her. "But I bring it." She stepped closer. "If danger comes, I'll face it with eyes open. I'd rather that than live fearing shadows." He nodded, but it was a nod that carried sadness. "I'll leave soon," he said. Not a question. "When the ground dries?" The ache in her chest then was sudden, and she hated it for being so tender. She turned away before he could see. Days passed. Rain came, then sun. The snow truly melted. The creek ran high. Trees budded. He planted onions beside her, kneeling in the dirt with sleeves rolled and sweat on his brow. She taught him the names of herbs. He taught her a word in his tongue. Nama, which he said meant enough or full. She tried it one morning, and he laughed. Not loud, but real. A joyful laugh. She wanted to keep it. Then one night, as dusk fell gentle as breath across the plains, the children asleep, they sat together on the porch. She offered him coffee, and he took it, though he rarely drank. The silence between them was different now. Not empty, not strained. "I dream of my wife," he said. Ellen looked at him but said nothing. "Lost her and our son long ago. Hard winter, no food, no help. I'm sorry." He nodded. She had eyes like yours. It caught her breath for a moment. Not the words, but how he said them. As if he meant something else entirely. And that came out instead. "I had a husband," she said after a silence. "He didn't die in war, just drank and never woke. I don't miss him, but I mourn what I thought he could have been." Tahu stared at the stars. "Grief's strange. Sometimes it sounds like a bird. Small, always near. She turned her face to the sky. A lone hawk circled the ridge, black against the dark. "Will you stay?" she asked, and was surprised by its rawness. He didn't answer right away, but then he said, "For now." And she understood. It was all he could give, and it was honest and enough. She smiled. The night folded around them. Inside, the children stirred in sleep. The air smelled of earth and sap, and somewhere far off, a wolf howled, not from hunger, but song. The sun returned fierce, as if the earth were stretching free of a long ache. It dried the last snow, turned mud to clay, and pushed crocuses to bloom along the cabin's path. Days grew long, but in Ellen's chest, time seemed to close in. Quiet moments lingered longer than they needed. Good mornings meant more than ever. Tahu built a new fence that week. The old one had buckled under winter's weight, and without being asked, he set to righting what was broken. Josiah helped, carrying nails in an old tin box, while Ruth gathered wood scraps for kindling. Ellen watched from the porch, one hand resting lightly on her hip, the other shading her eyes. The man who'd once lain dying by her barn now stood tall under a clear sky. Hammer in hand, sleeves rolled to elbows, quiet strength in every motion. He looked like he belonged, like the land with all its rough edges and slow forgiveness had claimed him. But peace on the plains never lasted. It began with dust on the horizon, a clean line, too sharp for wind, too steady for a storm. By midday, the cavalry appeared, 3 men riding down the south ridge. Ellen stood still on the porch, squinting. Tahu had seen them. He straightened slowly, handed the hammer to Josiah without a word. The boy sensed the shift, looked to his mother, then the man beside her. Tahu said one word, "Go." Ellen didn't argue. She ushered the children into the cabin, then turned to him. "Friends of yours." He shook his head. "Soldiers. Hunters could be worse. They're coming fast." He nodded once. "I'll talk as you'd talk. I won't fight. Not here. Not with them watching." She understood. The children. Their eyes. The memories they'd carry if things went wrong. The riders arrived in dust and sweat, their horses lean, trail-worn. The men atop them looked weary. One was older, a gaunt man with a rifle slung across his back. The second was broader, tanned, a scar running from ear to jaw. The third was young, too young, with a face still learning hardness but trying. They dismounted without ceremony. Widow Dean, the older one, called. Ellen stepped forward. "That's me. We're tracking a wounded man." Comanche ran south after a skirmish outside Copper Ridge. Lost some good men. Her heart clenched. "We think he passed through here. Your neighbor Ellis says there's a stranger under your roof. Says he saw him out back. Of course he did." She crossed her arms. "I didn't take in raiders, just a traveler sick from the storm. Never spoke a word of fighting. You'll understand if we look around." Tahu stepped forward now. No weapon, no hiding. He moved with quiet grace, feet steady, eyes level. "I'm the man you're looking for," he said, voice calm, hoarse from disuse. The men reached for weapons. Ellen stepped between them. "He's not what you think." The big man laughed. "Ma'am, we know who he is. You don't shelter men like him unless you're confused or compromised. He hasn't harmed a soul. He's helped my children, saved my chickens, built the fence you're leaning on." The older man didn't blink. He was seen with a bow. "That's enough for us." Tahu raised his hands slowly, a gesture of strength, not surrender. "I ran," he said. "No fight, no blood on my hands." "Men died," the young one muttered, hand still on his gun. "Maybe they chased a man who didn't want to die." Ellen snapped. "Ever think of that?" The older man frowned, looked at her like she was a wild, dangerous thing. "You've got kids here. You want to risk them for a stranger?" Tahu's voice was steady. "I won't bring war to this place." Ellen turned to him, anger rising sharp up her spine. "You won't do that. You didn't run here to die." "I ran to live," he said. "But I won't be why they burn this." The men shifted. The big one spat on the ground. "Turn him over, or we come back with more." She looked at the men, their weapons, the dust still clinging to their boots like blood. Then at the children inside, watching through the window. Then at Tahu, who'd risked death to be kind. "Then you'd better come back with more," she said. The older man watched her a long time. Then Tahu, "We'll be back by week's end. If he's here, we take him. No questions." They mounted and left in silence. The dust hadn't settled when Ellen turned to Tahu, her voice trembling with controlled rage. "You were going to give up." He nodded once. "I've lived hunted. I know what ends." "Well, you're not alone anymore," she snapped. "Not in this house." That night, after the children slept, she sat by him near the hearth. She whispered, "You should go." Not because she wanted him to, but because the thought of him taken felt worse. He said, "I should, but you won't." "No." The silence between them was heavy, full of unspoken things. She reached for his hand. It was warm, rough, steady. "If they come back, we stand together." He didn't smile, but he didn't let go. Morning came, and he taught Josiah to set traps. Ruth followed him to the creek. Ellen watched him laugh as Josiah slipped in mud, as Ruth shrieked at a frog. His face, usually guarded, was open now. The past had found him, and it would return. But there was something else. He'd found a place where his name wasn't a curse, where his silence was understood, where his hands built instead of broke, and that was worth fighting for. Later, as the sun sank behind the hills into amber, Ellen stood on the porch and watched him fix the barn door. The wind carried pine and coming rain, she whispered to herself, almost inaudible. "Let them come?" He glanced over his shoulder, as if he'd heard, and nodded. Dawn came too quiet. No birdsong, no wind, just a heaviness in the air, like the world was braced. Ellen stood at the kitchen sink, hands still wet from washing, staring across the empty land beyond the fence. The sky was gold and clouded, but nothing kind, the kind of gold that comes before burning. Tahu was out checking the barn door again. His movements guided, practiced. He'd oiled the hinges the night before, rehung tools, cleared the back path with care. He said nothing, but everything in him moved with the purpose of a man expecting an end. Ellen felt it too, even before the first hoofbeats broke the morning silence. She heard them before she saw them. More horses than before. 6, maybe 7. The rhythm of intent, not a friendly visit, not an inquiry. This was a storm on horseback, and it was coming straight for them. She stepped outside, rifle in hand, not raised but not hidden. Tahu joined her at the porch's edge, his shoulder taut beneath the cotton shirt she'd mended a week ago. The shirt he'd worn when he taught Ruth to hear trout in running water. The shirt Josiah had tried to patch just to be like him. They stood side by side, still, as the riders came into view through the dust. Ellis led, his face smug and rigid, followed by the three from before and more, armed men from nearby ranches, their eyes already full of judgment. Ellis didn't dismount. He looked down at Ellen with the look he'd once used to size up cattle. His voice rang like a hammer. "You were warned. This is your last chance. You brought all these men to kill one." Ellen asked, calm, but only just, "Or you here for me too?" Ellis squinted. "We're here to protect what's left of decency in this valley." "You're hiding a killer." "He's no killer," she said. "But I might be if you keep that rifle tight." One of the younger riders shifted in his saddle, nervous. The rest were harder, colder. Tahu stayed silent, still beside her, the weight of every fight he'd ever faced sitting on his shoulders like old iron armor. The older man, Madden, the one with the scar, spoke up. "No need for this to get ugly. Ma'am, just step aside." But she didn't. She stepped forward. "Not this time," she said. "You didn't come for justice. You came to make an example of a man who doesn't kneel when you call. You came because a woman stood up and didn't ask your help." Madden frowned. "You're choosing him over yourself." She met his eyes without blinking. "He's mine." Behind her, inside the cabin. The children were silent. She'd told them to hide in the root cellar when they heard horses. Ruth had cried. Josiah gripped his hands until his knuckles went white. She'd held them both until their breathing slowed and kissed their heads like she might never again. One rider reached for his rifle. The barn door swung open. Tahu stepped forward, but not to strike. He tossed something small to the ground. His knife, the one he'd carved claw marks into the hilt. A peace offering, or maybe a line drawn. "I won't run," he said, "but I won't be taken." Ellis's face twisted, disgusted. He raised his rifle. A shot cracked like the world splitting. But it wasn't Tahu who fired. It was Ellen. Her rifle smoked. Ellis's hat flew off as the bullet tore through its brim. He flinched, reeled, nearly fell from his horse. "Fire again," she said, voice low, "and the next one finds your heart." Another man raised his weapon. Tahu moved like wind. He tackled the rider from his horse, the two men hitting the ground in a tangle of dust and limbs. The man rolled, reached for his sidearm, but Tahu was faster. He slammed the rifle's butt into the man's temple. The man went limp. Shots rang out. Chaos erupted. Ellen fell back behind the porch rail, reloading faster, firing faster. She didn't aim to kill. Her purpose was to warn, to break the line, to defend. Tahu moved like a creature born to survive. Not anger, not vengeance, but precision. He disarmed a second man, turned the rider's own pistol on him, held steady until the man dropped his weapon to the dirt. But it didn't last. Too many attackers, brave only in numbers, and numbers crumble fast when one falls. One man shouted, dodging Ellen's bullet. Another turned and fled without a word. The youngest dropped his gun, hands high, backing away like he wanted to vanish. Madden yanked his horse, cursing. "We'll be back," he yelled. "You're done here." Ellen stepped from the porch, shoulders rising with each breath. She loaded another round and aimed straight at him. "No," she said. "You are." The silence that followed was thick as molasses. They rode off in pieces, a broken storm, pride dragging behind like tattered flags. The air settled. Dust drifted again. Tahu lowered the weapon, and it was done. Ellen stood still a long time, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Her hands shook, not from fear but release. She looked at Tahu, his lip bleeding, shirt torn, but standing there. The children ran from the cellar. Josiah reached her, arms wrapping her waist so tight she could barely breathe. Ruth ran to Tahu, threw her arms around him, buried her face in his side. He froze for half a heartbeat, then gently placed a hand on her head. "I thought you'd go," Ruth said, voice choked. "I said I'd stay," he replied, voice rough. Then they buried the fight. No bodies, just cracked earth, bullet holes in the barn wall, a dented rail. Proof of survival. Not victory. Just survival. That night, they lit a new fire in the yard. The children sat on blankets, Tahu beside them, Ellen watching from the porch steps, a mug of chicory in hand. She looked at the sky, black as velvet, stars scattered like prayers, and felt something shift in her chest. Not the end of danger, but the start of belonging. Tahu sat with her, said nothing. She offered the mug. He took a sip, winced, too bitter. He said, she smiled, "Tastes like peace to me." They sat in silence a while longer. The kind of silence that didn't press, didn't hurt. After a time, he said, "I'll build a better barn." "We'll build it together," she replied. He nodded. "Home," he said, the words strange in his mouth, but not lost. "Home," she echoed, softer. "Stay." He looked at her. No surprise, no hesitation. "I'm not leaving." In the days that followed, neighbors came quietly. No apologies, just gifts left on the porch. Flour, salt, a spool of thread, even a chicken. No one spoke, but the message was clear. You were right. We were wrong. We won't talk about it. Ellen accepted each gift with calm. The barn was rebuilt with new timber and seasoned hands. The children helped. Tahu carved their names into one of the beams. Ellen carved hers beside his. One spring evening, with golden light stretching across the valley, they stood together at the threshold of a new life. And as the sun sank, burning the horizon, Ellen turned to him, her hand taking his. "You changed my life," she whispered. He shook his head. "You saved me." They stood silent as the earth breathed with them, and something in the wind sounded like a lullaby. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you felt the fire's glow and heard the silence between two souls learning to trust, don't stay silent, step forward, like, comment, and subscribe for more tales of the Wild West, woven from resilience and grace. And let me know where you're watching from in this wide world.